So that was a not so veiled threat to kill her if she doesn't play ball. While Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, they don't really extract and refine it. They don't actually produce very much oil. The Trump administration is not even pretending that this was complying with international law. I think that the most likely move is on Greenland. I mean, it's really weird right now because Europeans are simultaneously worried that America is going to steal Greenland from Denmark, and also trying to get the United States to commit to providing security guarantees to Ukraine. This makes Russia think we're really in a new era of international politics, and it definitely cannot trust the United States and the West with any kind of peace deal in Ukraine.
If you want to know why the U.S. just captured the leader of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, what is likely to happen next in the country, whether or not this was a 12D chess move that gave America $17 trillion worth of oil, or an unnecessary and potentially unconstitutional escalation, and how all of this affects America's relationship with Russia, Europe, and China, keep watching. I'm John Rush, and today I'm speaking with Andrew Day, the senior editor of the American Conservative, where he focuses on U.S. foreign policy. What happened in Venezuela a couple days ago? What is the situation on the ground now? Give us the 10,000-foot view.
Well, ever since I think August, we've been watching this military buildup in the Caribbean, this military buildup by the U.S. They framed it as a counter-narcotics operation that never really held water, I guess you could say, because the main drug that kills Americans is fentanyl. Fentanyl doesn't come from Venezuela. So we were kind of waiting to see what this was building up to exactly. And then overnight, Friday into Saturday morning, we found out, at least so far, the main thing that has happened, the main intervention, is a special ops intervention in Venezuela that only lasted, I think, 2.5 hours. And that resulted in the successful capture of Nicolas Maduro, the socialist strongman president of Venezuela. It was an impressive operation in that 150 military airplanes escorted black helicopters that delivered these elite special forces to Maduro's military compound residence, and they were able to get in there and nab him and his wife before they were able to get into a safe room, and then they delivered them to New York City, where they faced drug and weapons charges in a U.S. district court in New York. So that's basically what happened. As far as what happens next, that's much less clear. People who were expecting some kind of regime change operation thought that maybe they would install the Nobel laureate Maria Machado. She was the leader of the opposition. She actually, at least at one point, was very popular among Venezuelans. But the Trump administration has decided not to do that. In fact, the operation wasn't even really a regime change operation because they left the other leaders of the regime in place, and power has now transferred to the vice president turned acting president turned, I guess, now formal president. She's been sworn in. Delcy Rodriguez. She was a deputy of Maduro, obviously. Her father was a Marxist, communist guerrilla who actually was tortured to death after he killed, I think, an American businessman or something like that, or was alleged to have done something like that. So she has a kind of left-wing socialist credentials, but she also is fairly technocratic. She was educated in France, I believe, at a university. And the Trump administration has determined, for reasons that are somewhat clear and somewhat vague, that she is probably the best person to lead the transition and to govern Venezuela, at least until elections take place at some undetermined point in the future. And the Trump administration is not really pushing for elections or anything like that. So they're going to try to work with her. And whether that works, it really depends on how other leaders within Venezuela respond to Delcy Rodriguez. There are these paramilitary groups called, I think, colectivos. I'm not a regional expert or specialist in Venezuela by any means, but they're paramilitary groups. They are often headed by very rough-looking men who Maduro evidently was able to keep under his thumb, or at least able to keep happy enough to go along with his rule. Whether Delcy Rodriguez is able to do that is kind of the $64 question right now, so to speak.
And what are those reasons? Why Delcy Rodriguez?
So Initially, there was speculation that the reason Trump went for Delcy Rodriguez is because he was annoyed that Machado won the Nobel Peace Prize. Obviously, Trump has become very fixated on winning that prize for himself. She dedicated the prize to him after she won it. She's now saying she might be willing to share it with him in some sense, at least let him have the actual medal, I guess. Um, I think that that's not the actual reason. Based on some reporting that's come out in recent days, it seems like intelligence assessments determined that Delcy Rodriguez would clearly be uh, the best option in terms of mitigating risks at this very volatile, intense moment in Venezuela. If the United States just tried to install their preferred opposition candidate, even though at one point she and the opposition generally had a lot of support, perhaps they still do have a lot of popularity. Might have trouble keeping all of these military figures that I mentioned in line. And so this is, I think, seen as a kind of smoother transition. They get rid of Maduro, the number one guy that they don't like, who Trump has had beef with for a very long time, and they get this more pliable, compliant number two to take his place, to kind of play ball with the regime. There's even been reporting that suggests that Rodriguez and one of her family members, I think a brother-in-law, were involved in negotiations with the Trump administration prior to this military operation on Saturday. We do know that there was some CIA source within the Venezuelan government who was giving information on Maduro's daily routine and his whereabouts, and that might have been Delcy Rodriguez, although that's not been confirmed. So they might have been working with her for a long time. Or even if they haven't been working with her since before the operation, they've now determined that it's probably easier and lower risk for them to just let her stay in charge. And they'll keep an eye on whether she is compliant with their wishes. And they are maintaining this oil embargo, this oil blockade, which actually they're enforcing like today by trying to get all these so-called shadow fleet Venezuelan tankers, or tankers that are associated with the Venezuelan oil industry. They'll keep that blockade up as a point of leverage to make sure she plays ball, and really she's got a gun to her head, basically. Trump in the press conference where he was first talking about the raid, he said that Delcy Rodriguez seemed like someone that they could work with, and that she had been talking to Marco Rubio on the phone. And then Rodriguez released this very kind of hostile, defiant statement. She continued to refer to Maduro as the lawful president of Venezuela, and Trump came out and said, if she keeps that up, something worse is going to happen to her than happened to Maduro. Well, what could that be? I mean, what happened to Maduro was pretty bad. He got basically kidnapped along with his wife by U.S. Special Forces in the dead of night, and then taken on a ship and a helicopter and a plane to New York City, where he faces, imprisonment for the rest of his life. So what's worse than that is she gets killed, right? So that was a not so veiled threat to kill her if she doesn't play ball. I suspect that she will try to play ball, but the difficulty for her is that she also needs to maintain credibility and legitimacy internally within Venezuela. And, this is a government that has a left-wing, anti-imperial, anti-American ideology. So the closer she gets to the Trump administration, the less trusting people and other elites, Maduro loyalists, might be of her.
So at this point, I think more or less everybody has heard the stated reasons for the raid. It was a counter-drug operation is what they're saying. What do you think the actual reasons were, and why now?
It's a difficult question, and clearly the Trump administration has not been very forthright in telling us what the actual motivations are. In political science, there's this notion of things being overdetermined, like in a causal sense, where there are so many factors that are causing an event that even if you removed one or more of them, the event still would have happened, right? And I think it's something like that, where there are a lot of factors that came together that made the Trump administration think that this was a good idea. I think one of those factors pertains to domestic politics. In Florida, there's a community, the Little Havana community. There's a lot of Cubans and Venezuelans who are very hawkish on Latin America issues, and they want the United States to intervene in Latin America to topple these governments that they fled from, right? One such person happens to be the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. His name is Marco Rubio, and he is a hawk. He is like the most establishment figure of the Trump administration, someone that neoconservatives and liberal internationalists kind of thought might be able to rein Trump in a little bit in his second term, but he happens to be like the most hawkish person in the U.S. government on Latin American issues, and he's clearly been a driving force on this. Stephen Miller, who was a a top advisor to Donald Trump and a trusted ally and loyalist of Trump, he's gotten on board with the Venezuela stuff. At one point in the administration, they had to think about what to do with the fact that Chevron was still operating in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez, the predecessor of Maduro, nationalized the oil industry. He imposed harsher terms on contracts with American oil companies. And a couple of them left, but Chevron stayed and had this special arrangement worked out with the Maduro government and the Biden administration. And the Trump administration had to figure out what to do with that Chevron special licensing agreement. They ultimately decided to renew it. But after they did that, there's been reporting that they felt they needed to do something hawkish against Venezuela to, throw a bone to this community that I mentioned earlier, these hawkish Latin American types, right, who are based in Florida and have an important face in the administration. And so that's when Stephen Miller, who's the head of immigration policy, basically, he came along and said, well, why don't we target drugs somehow? We can target fentanyl labs. And they eventually decided, no, those are in Mexico. Scheinbaum is working with us. We can target these boats in the Caribbean that are associated with Venezuela and that are allegedly transporting drugs actually to Europe, although they don't emphasize that for obvious reasons. So that's when this thing got started. But I think there's also this element of they just want to pick up a poor, weak country in Latin America and throw it against the wall to kind of show that we're the big dog in the Western Hemisphere. The Trump administration is really reviving and adding to and putting a certain interpretation on the Monroe Doctrine, this idea that we're the big dog in the Western Hemisphere. They have a very hawkish interpretation of that doctrine, and they're trying to enforce it now in this new era of multipolarity and great power politics. And I think Venezuela, maybe because it's kind of far away, because it has this like left-wing leader he's not a very sympathetic figure in the eyes of most Americans. They decided that this was a good theater to kind of demonstrate this strength.
Another theory that I've seen thrown around online right now is the idea essentially of oil leverage, right? So most people are learning quickly that Venezuela has the largest provable oil reserves of any country in the world. So most people's natural assumption is, well, obviously that has to be connected. Of course, the old joke, if there's oil there, that's where the U.S. is going. How much of this do you think is related to that? This idea that we are trying to regulate the control of oil, not necessarily for ourselves, but to limit how much is available for China, and then also to impact oil prices, which can, of course, indirectly impact Iran and Russia.
It's interesting because the Iraq War, a lot of people, especially on the left at the time that the George W. Bush administration launched that war, we're saying this isn't a war for democracy, this is a war for oil. And now we're in a situation where a Republican administration is basically saying this is a war for oil, and a lot of critics are kind of skeptical of that, right? Ever since the operation, we hadn't been hearing much about oil until the special ops intervention on, overnight Friday. But ever since then, the Trump administration, I think, has been emphasizing this as the main stated justification that they do have, as you say, the largest proven oil reserves in the world. And that we want to have access to that. We want to have control over that. And we want Venezuela to not partner with China in particular in producing that oil. I think that that's probably true. That's definitely, I would say, a factor. But I don't know if they're actually going to be able to achieve something that looks like a success to the American people. Because while Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, they don't really extract and refine it. They don't actually produce very much oil relative to what you would expect given their huge reserves, because they just lack the infrastructure for it as a result partly of U.S. sanctions on their oil industry and partly of just severe economic mismanagement by these socialist strongmen who have led Venezuela. So it's going to require that U.S. companies decide to invest in Venezuela's oil industry, right? To set up the infrastructure that is necessary. And if you were the head of an oil company, would you invest in Venezuela right now? I mean, it seems like an awfully risky bet. Like, who knows what this country is going to look like in 5 years? Who knows what this country is going to look like in 5 days, right? I think they're going to want to wait and see. They're going to want to have some sort of assurance that this is actually a stable political situation, that there's going to be some sort of legitimate government that is able to deliver basic goods, public goods, including just public safety. And there's going to have to be some clear transition to the next government, Otherwise, I think they're going to be extremely hesitant to actually pour money into this place. And there's like a lot of armed groups in Latin America. I mean, this could get really bad. The worst case scenario here is quite chaotic, right? So I don't know if the Trump administration is actually going to succeed in like producing all of this oil and getting U.S. companies to profit from it. But they're doing what they can now to just kind of seize the oil that does exist, bring it to America. Previously, it had been sanctioned. It's still sanctioned for other countries, but I guess this is all breaking development. We're recording on Wednesday, and a lot of this stuff is breaking today. They want to be in charge of where this oil goes that does exist. I just don't know if they're going to actually be able to extract and refine much more of it, the stuff that's in the ground.
So you're saying the claims that we're seeing thrown around right now about how we have added $17 trillion to the American economy, that is not correct, it sounds like.
That will probably not happen ever. I mean, the best case scenario, it's like the numbers aren't, I mean, I assume, you never know with Trump and the people around him, but I assume that those numbers aren't like invented, like if we get this stuff produced, if we bring the Venezuelan oil industry online, that is its potential. But there's just a lot that's preventing the potential from being realized, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that makes sense. So another interesting fact is the relation between Venezuela and Russia. So not just the oil, but Fiona Hill, Trump's former National Security Council senior director, she testified during the Trump's first impeachment, that Russia had floated a deal to swap Venezuela for Ukraine through informal communications. So her quote was, they were basically signaling, you have your Monroe Doctrine. You want us out of your backyard? Well, we have our own version of this. You're in our backyard in Ukraine. So what do you make of that? Did we just take our chess piece off the board, so to speak, if that's true?
I'm very skeptical of those claims by her. And if you look into the sourcing of those claims, you'll see that she's referencing like things that were just published in Russian newspapers and interpreting them as signals to the US, that they want to make this kind of spheres of influence agreement and this like Ukraine for Venezuela trade, as you put it. So the first thing I would say is I don't actually believe that they made such an offer. However, I do talk to a lot of Russian elites and people in like the national security world in Moscow. And, they are interested in this element of Trump's foreign policy program and ideology to the extent that he has an ideology. They like the idea of Russia being one of the big dogs, and having a sphere of influence. I don't think that they are going to be very happy with Trump for much longer, because I just don't think that the Trump administration thinks about this issue in the way that they're hoping he does. There's, I think, a lot of wishful thinking on the part of the Russian political elite, maybe not on the part of Putin himself, but on the part of certain Russian national security types who have this spheres of influence framework. And the reason I think that they are overly optimistic by their, according to their own interests, about Trump, is if you read the recently released national security strategy, if you listen to the pronouncements of the Trump administration, if you just see what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, I don't think they have this view that America has the Western Hemisphere and China has the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific and Russia has Eurasia. I think that what they clearly have a view of is, we have the Western Hemisphere, and we're also going to compete with China and the Asia Pacific, and we're also going to compete with Russia in its own neighborhood. Now, obviously, Trump and especially Vice President J.D. Vance are not the most reliable supporters of Ukraine. So in that particular conflict, they want Europe to shoulder much more of a burden. They just generally want Europe to shoulder more of a security burden and to increase, how much it's paying for its own defense, so that America could possibly, if it needs to, pursue some kind of retrenchment from Europe and refocus to other regions. But ultimately, I think Trump is actually pretty hawkish towards Russia. Um, and, he's facilitated, greenlit, even authorized intelligence to Ukraine for like long range strikes in Russia, drone attacks in Russia. He at one point dispatched a nuclear submarine to waters around Russia during his like social media beef with Medvedev. Um, and so I don't think that this quid pro quo trade was offered, and I don't think it's the kind of thing that Trump would agree to. But I do think that we are moving into some sort of world that comes after the post World War II international legal liberal order, and that world that we're entering into, this multipolar world, in part because of the way the Trump administration is acting on the world stage right now, is going to be one in which I guess you could say might makes right, and the great powers have a different attitude, a different understanding of what the script of international behavior is, and they exercise military force more readily to secure their interests. Um, I think that that's a likelihood going forward.
So, when asked about the legality of this operation in a recent interview, Marco Rubio responded, quote, "This was an arrest operation. This was a law enforcement operation. We have court orders for each operation, that will continue to be in place until the people who have control over the levers of power in that country make changes that are not just in the interests of the people of Venezuela, but are in the interests of the United States." End quote. So, what do you make of that framing? When most people hear the words arrest operation, they think SWAT raid in Detroit. And isn't he really admitting two things here? Number one, that we are acting as a police force outside of our own borders in another sovereign country. And then B, that we're essentially acting as a corrupt police force, right? We're arresting people who are not acting in our interests.
Yeah, this framing is really quite notable. I mean, the Trump administration is not even pretending that this was complying with international law. They're not referencing international law. Normally states will do that. Like even the George W. Bush administration tried to get authorization from the UN Security Council and then ultimately justified its Iraq war as being in self-defense. Like they face an imminent threat from Iraq, and so even under the UN Charter, transborder aggression is proscribed, but transborder military action is allowed if it's in your nation's defense. And the Trump administration has framed this as a kind of self-defense, like because they're claiming that Venezuela is shipping a lot of dangerous people and drugs to America that kill Americans, but they're not doing that in a way that tries to justify it in terms of international law. And to the extent that we've heard a legal justification, it's the one that you just mentioned, that Maduro has been indicted in New York on drug and weapons charges, and therefore, we need to arrest him to bring him to justice. And they framed this overnight raid this weekend as a law enforcement operation. There were actually like FBI agents on the helicopters. Um, and the idea was they just needed like a military escort. I don't know if those FBI agents got off the helicopters. It was Delta Force Special Ops who went and got Maduro, but they just did that to make it a kind of formal law enforcement arrest, right? And they indeed, they didn't ship him to Gitmo. Like they did bring him to a court in New York where he has like the full rights afforded to people in America when they're being accused of something. He'll have a lawyer and so forth. So they've kind of put their money where their mouth is, and I assume they do that because they think they have a case against him legally. But you're right that this is like totally bizarre for for a bizarre precedent to set, where so it's really quite easy to indict someone.
Hmm.
So if we just indict a leader like of a foreign country, the United States, if our own president doesn't like that leader, can send our forces to like apprehend that leader, that's crazy. That breaks all sorts of like international norms, obviously. So I think that the justification is indeed notable. It's remarkable. I think it sets a worrying precedent if you're someone like Volodymyr Zelensky, for example. I mean, Russia seems to have tried and failed to kill him, so it's not like they were especially inhibited. But I can imagine they think that this is now on the table in the way that it used to not be. Maybe Putin will also be kind of paranoid that something like this could happen to him. You know, Russia claims, and I don't think they're lying. I think they were just mistaken that Putin's residence was targeted by a Ukrainian drone attack recently. So the timing is interesting. I'm not saying the timing is connected. It's like coincidental, but I think it maybe can inflame Putin's paranoia. And from a constitutional perspective here in America, like this is pretty disastrous that the president has just kind of arrogated to himself the power to like kidnap a foreign leader, without consulting Congress. They said that the reason they didn't consult Congress is because they didn't know exactly when the mission was going to take place. It depended on the weather, and they didn't want Congress to leak this. Well, the thing got leaked anyway, actually, from someone in the Trump administration, and the New York Times complied and just didn't release the information before the thing happened. But that is not how our constitutional system is supposed to work in terms of war making. But to kind of like steelman the opposite case, you could probably tell I'm critical of this operation. Like this thing lasted for 2.5 hours. It was in the service of a law enforcement arrest. I mean, we can't deny that the guy was brought to a courthouse, um, and I don't know if like it's so limited compared to other interventions. Even for example, even like Reagan's intervention in Grenada or George H.W. Bush's much larger intervention in Panama. Certainly compared to like Iraq and Libya, although Libya had national security authorization initially. It's so limited compared to that. It's more kind of in the category of like Obama's raid to get Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Like no one said we were at war with Pakistan when that happened. No one thought that Obama needed to get Congress to declare war against Pakistan in order to do that. This is different because I mentioned it's a world leader. But I really think, Trump is not as he's not really departing that radically from the foreign policy establishment and the foreign policy consensus that has developed over recent decades. And maybe that's itself a very poor reflection on leaders like George W. Bush and Obama, who kind of set the precedents and eroded the norms that led to this operation.
How is that process supposed to work? What is the normal checklist that if you're president, you have to do X, Y, and Z before you can do something like this?
No, I mean, I have no idea in particular when it comes to like special ops.
Well, I mean more in terms of the constitutionality, right? You mentioned Congress. What are the broad strokes of what's supposed to occur before, and what would make this unconstitutional, for example?
Well, from the perspective of, I mean, it's a complicated issue, and I'm not really the guy that should be like explaining this. I don't think I'm not like an expert in constitutional law, but Congress is supposed to declare war, and then the president is supposed to execute a war, right? But we've had an imperial presidency develop over the course of recent decades, where we already obviously have standing armies, right? Like that, the founders weren't even imagining that. And the president deploys them at will, and then we have special ops, and we have all sorts of covert operations going on all the time. You know, the president is supposed to notify Congress within a certain amount of time after a campaign begins. Congress would be able to assert its authority, but it's just like neglected to do so. I mean, part of the problem here is that Congress doesn't want the accountability that comes from being like in charge of our authorized military interventions overseas. And so it just has kind of ceded this authority to the presidency, right? And they don't assert their war powers authority. In fact, they recently voted specifically not to do so when someone tried to bring a war powers authorization bill to the floor of Congress.
And in terms of further interventions, I mean, this has been one of the things that's maybe most disturbing to people watching this is, I think just a couple hours ago we had Rick Scott saying we were going to implement regime change in Colombia, Nicaragua. There was at least one other country. Trump is talking about.
Nicaragua, really? I didn't see that. That's crazy.
I think it was. Yeah, I'd have to double check that, but it was three countries. I'm forgetting one of them. He said we are going to bring democracy to South America. And then Trump is talking about annexing Greenland, implied that there are more operations coming, said something to the effect that we can do this anytime we want, called it the Don Roe Doctrine, as you alluded to, said we're locked and loaded to defend protesters in Iran. It's a little bit disorienting if you're watching this and you were alive during Iraq or you've been paying attention the last 20 years. So, how much of this do you think is part of the deal bluffing? I'm keeping everybody on their toes as a really a negotiation tactic, or is this just, hey, this is what I plan on doing and that's how it is? Just a continuation of the policies that you were just talking about.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Um, right after the operation, which we should emphasize was like a spectacular tactical success, like no Americans died. They got Maduro. They did it all quickly. It like this thing could have gone really badly, and it didn't, right? So Trump is clearly kind of feeling his oats, right? Marco Rubio, Stephen Miller, they're riding high right now. I think that Trump in particular has developed a kind of grandiose conception of what he is able to accomplish using military power, right? We saw a kind of a glimmer of this after the strikes on Iran in June, and people disagree about whether it's fair to say that we destroyed Iran's nuclear capability. I think obviously on some level we didn't, but that also was like a very spectacular tactical success. And without really any negative consequences for Trump. They orchestrated this kind of retaliation with Iran so it could appear to be hitting back at us, but it was like meaningless. Um, and this time, same thing, but there's no negative consequences so far, right? So I think that they are in this mood to kind of keep going. And Trump this weekend he mentioned other countries that he said we might militarily intervene in. Mexico was mentioned. Colombia, I think, is a high likelihood. He said maybe not Cuba, because Cuba's already ready to fall. He mentioned Iran again. He's been saying if the Iranian government violently puts down these protests that have been going on, then the United States is locked and loaded and we'll go in there again. Greenland, they haven't ruled out military force, although Marco Rubio at the moment is kind of trying to calm tensions because we're like totally freaking out Europe right now. And especially Denmark, which owns Greenland, although it's governed with like a form of local control. The Marco Rubio is saying, well, Trump just wants to like buy Greenland, and like all of these threats are like a negotiating tactic. So that might be true. Trump kind of established his credibility in the sense, like I'm willing to use military power, and I'm capable, or my team is capable of planning military operations that like no other country could do. Like they say that, and that's true. I think I'm not like a chauvinist who like gets really like proud when my country does these like military actions. I'm just saying, and like in terms of my analysis, like it's true. Like the United States did demonstrate like incredible military power to the rest of the world, at least in terms of special ops, right? So I think Trump feels very proud about that, and it's it enhances his leverage, right? So he's making these threats, and it's impossible to say whether they're actually going to follow up on them, or whether it's just a more credible way as a result of the operation to extract the concessions that he wants from these various players. And I would say of these countries that we've mentioned, and I feel like I'm even forgetting one. I think that the most likely move is on Greenland. Like people in the Trump orbit actually do talk about Greenland. That kind of died down since the beginning of since earlier in the administration. But I think that they're going to go for it. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know exactly how Denmark is thinking about this, whether they would be able to make some sort of deal to just relinquish control of it over it. Um, I actually think if the United States decided to just send a bunch of warplanes there and put a bunch of like warships around it, I mean it's technically a big island, that they could just do it, Like I don't I can't imagine Europe would have a united forceful response and like go to war with the United States to prevent this. And I think the people in the Trump administration know that. This whole thing is stupid because Denmark is like America's most pliable ally historically. So they would probably give us whatever the hell we wanted, in terms of access to its rare earths, as we all say now, critical minerals and such, in terms of American military basing, in terms of things to keep Russia and Chinese influence out of Greenland. Denmark, whatever the Trump administration is trying to get out of Greenland, I think they could get through just diplomacy. But for some reason that they're not in a very diplomatic mood.
One thing that's interesting is the lack of response from other countries. So almost everybody, except for Israel, it seems, has condemned what we did in Venezuela, or at least criticized it. But we haven't really seen any significant reactions. Do you think that encourages us to keep doing this? And it seems like that's what you're implying. And then if so, do we run the risk of playing that game with your sibling when you keep, I'm not hitting you, I'm not hitting you, and then, you get smacked in the mouth at some point?
Yeah, I think we run that risk, but I don't think that risk comes from Europe, to be frank. And I love Europe. I'm not one of these like American chauvinists who like talks about how Europeans are like weak right now and they're like our bitch and we make them do whatever we want. Like I hate that rhetoric. I don't agree with that at all. I'm a legal resident of the European Union. I live in America, but I used to live in the Czech Republic. Um, but it is true that like Europe is too internally divided and too weak to really do anything about it. I do think that we're going to see a kind of fraying of the transatlantic alliance. I mean, it's really weird right now because Europeans are simultaneously worried that America is going to steal Greenland from Denmark, and also trying to get the United States to commit to providing security guarantees to Ukraine. And it's kind of like, okay, you're afraid we're gonna invade you, and you also want us to protect you. Like you guys probably need to work out how exactly you think about the United States right now. I think that they do sort of hope that once Trump is just going to seem like a bad dream one day. And once he's gone, like America will return to normalcy. And I think that that might happen. Um, but in the interim, I don't know if they can bet on that. And I think that there might be some sort of break where like Canada joins the European Union and the European Union distances itself from the United States, and becomes like an alternative to NATO, which excluding the United States. But that's long term because, as I said, they're so weak and dependent on the United States that they can't really go that route, and they really lack internal unity. So that's one bad thing that could come out of this, but I don't think Trump cares much about all the stuff that I just said. The stuff that could happen that he would care about is if our boldness and militarism and apparent imperialism on the world stage collides with the interests of China and Russia, or if one of those two great powers decides they can't have this anymore and the risks of not doing anything are worse than the risks of just going, of striking back somehow. So, the United States, for example, just today, I don't know that I don't understand the details really, but we're enforcing these sanctions against Venezuelan oil. There is a tanker associated with the Venezuelan oil trade that was Russian flagged for some reason, and was possibly being escorted by like a Russian submarine, and the United States seized it. And the Kremlin right now, before we started taping, I saw their foreign ministry had a statement about how the United States should like respect the rights of the Russians that were on board that vessel. So that's already like really concerning. That like if we seized and our people boarded a vessel that was being escorted by Russian military submarines, you can imagine this getting out of hand easily. Uh, there's also, the situation in Ukraine is essentially a proxy war. Um, that can widen against the collective West in various ways. If Russia starts to feel like, okay, the United States is playing hardball right now, we need to play even more hardball than we've been doing in Ukraine. China could decide, okay, they're asserting domination in their sphere of influence. It's time for us to do the same over here, especially with regards to Taiwan. That could become a flashpoint for U.S.-China conflict, potentially catastrophic conflict. So yeah, I think that if we're feeling invincible right now, that because no state is invincible, that's inherently an irrational feeling. It's irrational, and it could lead us to a serious overreach that invites backlash from powerful countries.
One of Russia's primary criticisms, which Putin made very explicitly in his February 24th, 2022 speech right after the invasion, is that the US treats other countries as inferior and essentially unworthy of their own sovereignty. So he said, quote, anything that does not suit the dominant state, the powers that be, that's us, the US, is denounced as archaic, obsolete, and useless. At the same time, anything it regards as useful is presented as the ultimate truth and forced on others regardless of the cost, abusively and by any means available. Those who refuse to comply are subjected to strong arm tactics. What I am saying now does not only concern Russia, and Russia is not the only country that is worried about this. That last sentence sounds very prophetic. He predicted that other countries would find themselves in Russia's position. Haven't we just proved him correct?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. I mean, Putin's interesting because he came in, and this is not at all an unusual thing to say about a Russian leader historically, but he came into the presidency. When was he first installed? Like 1999 or something.
2000, I think. Yeah, something like that.
Um, he came in being kind of pro-Western and pro-American, and at least in the sense that he wanted Russia to kind of reintegrate with the West. And he thought, okay, the Cold War is over. This conflict is done. The Russians had a bit of a different way of interpreting the end of the Cold War than the West did. We saw it as like a triumph. They saw it as like a voluntary collapse of the Soviet Union and moving on into this different era of Russian history. Um, and then over time, because in large part of American malfeasance and international law breaking and militarism, he got alienated from the United States. We also were probably worse than Russia in terms of these like Cold War era arms control agreements. Um, we decided that we didn't really want those anymore. Russia is down. Russia's weak. Russia is just like a glorified gas station. Who cares about Russia? American elites really did have that attitude. And so, NATO expansion was part of that. The Iraq War was part of that. The intervention in Libya really pissed off Putin because he agreed not to block it at the United Nations Security Council, but then it went beyond what was authorized by the UN Security Council. It became like a regime change operation against Gaddafi. He was also upset about like Clinton's bombings of Serbia, which has like a kind of connection to Russia culturally. And so all of these actions by the United States did kind of help create the Putin that we see today. And I don't know what your view is of Putin exactly, but like I think he's a pretty bad guy, you know. And but I think that he, the United States really mismanaged its relations with Russia, and kind of created this monster of like Putin's Russia today. He's not at all unique within the Kremlin. He actually has like more hardline people to his nationalist right, um, compared to them, he's kind of pragmatic. And so I think Putin developed this extreme cynicism about international law and this feeling that like if America doesn't have to comply with international law, why should Russia? Especially because a lot of Russians, probably including Putin himself, in the case of Ukraine, for example, they do think that that is like something that they have a right to do, invading Ukraine, because of the treatment of the like alleged mistreatment of ethnic Russians in the Donbass, which, the allegations have a lot of merit. So Putin became cynical about international law, and yeah, international law is something worth being cynical about. So he said a lot of things that were true, and he, I think, basically recognized the hypocrisy that underpinned American action on the world stage. And so maybe some of his statements seem prophetic in that sense. But what I would point out is, like, he's also kind of participated in the erosion of international norms, right? It's not like he's this legal scholar or something, an angel and saint. Um, so if Russia's invasion of Ukraine in part was motivated by this frustration with American violations of international law and militarism and hypocrisy, well, it also contributed to this erosion, right? And maybe, and when Trump first saw that, he said, "Hey, that's pretty cool. He's like a really strong leader who's exerting power in his region. I want to do that too if I become president again." Like, he literally said things like that. I'm not making that up. It's a paraphrase. But right after the invasion, there was a quote from Trump to that effect. So I think you could say that made this Venezuela thing more likely, because right wingers in America have this view of like, okay, we're in a world of like bad guys, and we're gonna have to be bad guys ourselves to advance American interests.
It almost seems like a game theory problem, right? Where you have one side that, yeah, the rules only work if we're all playing by them. And the second one person stops, well, the incentive for everybody else to do that declines. And of course, then there's an incentive to escalate, because all states want to escalate, right? They want to grow, they want to get more power, typically. They want to accomplish their interests, and those are often in conflict with other countries. So it almost, maybe prophetic is the wrong word, but just calling a spade and saying, like, let's drop the pretense. This has been happening for 2 decades now, at least, maybe three, depending on what conflicts we're looking at. So put yourself in Putin's shoes now. And I don't really mean just Putin, of course. I mean his whole cabinet in the Kremlin. How do you think they're talking about this behind closed doors? Do you think this materially impacts the peace negotiations or alleged peace negotiations in Ukraine at all?
I think so. John Mearsheimer, the famous realist political science, thinks not, because he says Russia is just going to go for military victory in Ukraine, and this event doesn't affect that. And Europeans are very opposed to making the kind of deal with Russia that Putin is demanding, and that's not going to change, and that's not affected by Venezuela. I actually think that the situation has gotten worse for Russia-Ukraine diplomacy on a number of fronts. And this is somewhat speculative, but one is just distracting the United States. And like, if there was going to be a deal in Ukraine, it was going to require patient, skilled American diplomacy. And this makes that less likely, because like we're trying to conquer Greenland now, like we're very distracted. But kind of, more fundamentally, I think this makes Russia think we're really in a new era of international politics, and it definitely cannot trust the United States and the West with any kind of peace deal in Ukraine. It's just going to have to get capitulation from Ukraine on the battlefield. That's just the way the world works right now. America doesn't seem like it's in the mood to talk about international legal commitments and such. And so that's off the table if it wasn't already. I also think it makes Europe feel kind of the same way. Europe, I think, has an irrationally exaggerated perception of the threat that emanates from Russia. I don't want to be too harsh on European leaders, because like, I understand Russia seems very scary when you're in Europe, but nevertheless, it's like threat inflation on steroids. And I think that that's going to just get worse now, because European leaders have been worried that the United States is going to make some sort of tacit or maybe formal agreement with Russia of the kind that you suggested earlier, like a quid pro quo of some kind, where it's like, okay, Russia, you can have Eurasia. We don't really care anymore about Europe anyway. And so that being the case, they're really not going to want to make some sort of deal with Russia. I don't know who your audience is, or like if Eastern Europeans listen to you, so this might offend them, but like, Poles basically just want to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. right? Like they don't really necessarily, they're not really in a rush to end this war, whatever they say, because they see Russia as very threatening and they think that Ukrainians are bleeding them white. And I think that kind of logic just becomes even more difficult to dislodge from the psyche of some Europeans as a result of this operation in Venezuela, because they really don't trust the international legal order anymore. They don't trust the United States. They don't think that a kind of peaceful modus vivendi with Russia is possible in the new multipolar world. And I think all of this stuff just makes diplomacy even more difficult than it was already.
To the extent that the details are available about this supposed peace proposal that we have put on the table for Russia, what do you think of that? It sounds like you're skeptical that really that's going to be at play at all, right? It sounds like, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're saying this is going to get much worse before it gets better in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think the reaction to that 28-point peace plan showed why peace is just not attainable. I have nuanced opinions about the subject. And, sometimes people think that they accuse me of being like pro Putin or pro Russian or something, and I'm not. Sometimes people on the like MAGA right accuse me of being like pro Ukraine or something, and I'm not. Like, I think that my view is fairly balanced, and my honest assessment is that the situation in Ukraine is really, really bad for Ukrainians. Okay, I've been to Ukraine. I was in Kiev like 2 months ago. I was there during a massive drone and missile attack. Like, I slept in the bomb shelter. And I met with Ukrainian officials, and I met with former officials, and I met with academics the day afterwards. And they have a very grim view of what's coming for Ukraine. They have a very realistic, which is to say pessimistic view of what their leverage is vis-a-vis Russia. They were telling me that the air defense had totally cracked. They were telling me that they were running out of air defense interceptors. They were telling me that no more men in Ukraine want to fight, right? So Russia is winning this war of attrition, and it looks gradual, and it kind of looks pathetic, like they're not even able to capture their own mailbox. And there's a lot of truth to that. Like, this war, I think, is a catastrophe for Russia as well. Nevertheless, I think Russia correctly sees that it's winning the war, and so it's not going to settle for any deal that doesn't at least approximate what Ukrainian military capitulation would look like, because it thinks Ukrainian military capitulation is coming inevitably if the war continues, and it knows that the West is not willing to actually fight Russia over Ukraine. And we're like running out of our interceptors. We don't have a ton of like drones we could send to Ukraine. Public opinion in certain European countries suggests that their publics are getting kind of fed up with continuing to support Ukraine, or at least that risk exists. Ukraine, one of its disadvantages in this war is it's significantly more dependent on external support than Russia is. And so, given that asymmetry, we're going to have to, if the only deal that the only kind of deal it would make would be one that was very concessive. And that 28-point peace plan was received as if it was like a pro-Russian document, right? And by European leaders, by Ukrainian leaders, by Democrats and neoconservatives in the United States. And it wasn't. Like, the deal would actually probably need to be made more concessive in order to get the Kremlin to accept it. I'll give you an example. The deal said that Ukraine needed to have a cap on its armed forces so that it only had 600,000 armed forces after a peace settlement, okay? People treated that as if it was crazy. Like, you're going to cap how many armed forces they can have? No way. And then in the revised deal, it says that they can have 800,000, which is closer to what they currently have. This is crazy. They're not going to have anything approaching 600,000. They might have 300,000 armed forces afterwards. Military experts have looked at this. That's about all that they would be able to afford and to field in peacetime, like as a maximum. And people were acting like a 600,000 cap was just like a crazy concession to Russia because of the implications for Ukrainian sovereignty, right? And so I think people aren't in the right mindset to understand what's needed to end this war diplomatically. Because what's needed to end this war diplomatically is that Ukraine, it remains a sovereign country. It can join the European Union, but its sovereignty is very conditional. And it's very clear that Ukraine is next to it has like a terrible geographical luck. Like, it's next door to Russia, and so it's going to have some kind of, the peace settlement is going to be something that is not very pretty for Ukrainians, and I just don't think that the Ukrainians and the Europeans are actually ready to go that route, and that's one reason I think a peace deal is not forthcoming. I don't want to put all of the blame on them because obviously, the main issue is that Russia won't stop, but that's just kind of a given the military situation on the ground.
So, since the war started in Ukraine, one of the biggest variables that people have been speculating about is what does Russia actually want, right? On the maybe most charitable side, or maybe the most pro-Russian side, as some people might call it, it's they just want to secure the security of the Donbass and Luhansk, and that's really it. And anything beyond that is more or less just negotiating leverage, right? They'll take extra territory so that they can then give that back to get better concessions, whether it's troop limits in Ukraine or whatever. The more uh, worried perspective is they're just going to steamroll the entire country. I don't hear this as much anymore, but you had people say in Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia talking about how they really just want to steamroll all of Europe and do some, just takeover of Europe, which I haven't heard anybody really serious talk about that. But as you said, there are people in Europe who genuinely, I think, do believe that.
Yes.
So what do you think is Russia's actual goal now?
Well, first I'll say I think the original goal was to like turn Ukraine into like a Belarus and with a Russia-friendly government installed and just kick out the Western influence that way. And I think the war was motivated largely by a worry that Ukrainian was tilting west and having a growing military partnership with the United States and heading towards NATO membership, and then in the meantime, enhanced security partnership with the U.S. especially that made everyone in the Kremlin freaked out. And then they didn't achieve those goals, and so the question now is, what are its goals now, as you ask? And I think that they aren't going to settle for anything less than full control of the Donbass, number one. And Ukraine, very understandably, is hesitant to just voluntarily vacate the small, I think they still occupy like 20% of Donetsk or something, which is one of the provinces in the Donbass. They don't want to vacate that because it's like heavily fortified, and they worried that Russia could use that as a springboard for an additional, invasion westward. And so, I don't begrudge Ukraine for that, but Russia's not going to settle for anything short of complete control of the Donbass. There have been some indications that they'll settle for just what they've gotten so far from Kherson and Zaporizhia, but we've had some more hardline rhetoric from them actually in recent weeks on that score. So they might want to get all of that as well. I don't really know exactly what they'd be willing to stop for. I'm not even sure that they have a unified understanding of what the answer to that question is themselves. All I know is the longer this war goes on, the more their demands must increase, because the lower Ukraine's leverage becomes. And so right now, my guess would be they definitely 100% are going to get all of the Donbass. They probably also want all of Kherson and Zaporizhia, although they might be willing to compromise somewhat on that if they got some sort of written, verifiable commitments about like caps on Ukraine's armed forces, or maybe some deal where Zelensky leaves office, something that they could sell as a win at home.
Thank you for watching. Tell me what you think in the comments. What do you agree or disagree with? What would you like to learn more about? Who else should I talk to? And if you enjoyed this, subscribe and share it with one person who might enjoy it too. This has been the John Rush Show.